The little girl's spoon slipped from her fingers and struck the polished marble floor with a sharp metallic crack. Every head in the glass-walled executive dining room turned toward her, but 6-year-old Maribel Voss didn't seem to notice. Her pale face had gone still, her wide eyes fixed on the exhausted man standing near the doorway in a faded blue shirt, holding a worn folder against his chest as security prepared to escort him away. Only moments earlier, her mother, Billionaire CEO Serafina Voss, had rejected his desperate request for work without even looking closely at him. Then Maribel reached for her mother's hand and whispered words that seemed to stop the entire building from breathing. "Mom, that's my dad." Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Echo Tales if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet miracles that can change a life when someone chooses compassion over judgment. That morning had begun beneath a clear spring sky, sunlight spilling across the towers of downtown Belhaven and turning the windows of Voss Global into walls of gold. Serafina arrived at precisely 8 o'clock in a black sedan, dressed in an ivory suit that looked untouched by the world outside. At 38, she had built one of the country's largest medical technology companies from the remains of her father's failing laboratory. Business magazines praised her discipline, investors feared her silence, and employees joked that she could detect weakness before a person even entered the room. Few knew that behind the private elevators, the guarded penthouse, and the carefully controlled public image, Serafina lived with a fear no amount of money could erase. Her daughter had stopped trusting the world. Maribel rarely spoke to strangers, cried whenever Serafina left for more than a few hours, and kept asking questions about the father she had never met. Serafina always gave the same answer. He had disappeared before Maribel was born. He had chosen another life. He was not coming back. Across the city, Callum Rourke was helping his 8-year-old son, Tobin, button a school shirt with one missing cuff. Their apartment sat above a closed laundromat, in a neighborhood where delivery trucks rattled the windows from sunrise until evening. The refrigerator held half a carton of milk, 3 eggs, and a jar of mustard. A red notice from the landlord sat unopened on the kitchen table because Callum already knew what it said. He was 6 weeks behind on rent. For 3 years he had raised Tobin alone, after the boy's mother died from complications following heart surgery. Callum had once been a respected biomedical engineer with a promising career, but after her death he had walked away from conference rooms, patents, and laboratories to care for his grieving son. When he finally tried to return, the industry had moved on, and his damaged reputation followed him everywhere. People remembered the investigation at Voss Global, the missing research data, the accusation that he had tried to steal a prototype. They didn't remember that the case had been quietly dropped. They didn't know he had never been given a chance to defend himself. Callum had applied to Voss Global 17 times. Each application vanished without a response. On that bright morning, he decided a letter or an email were no longer enough. After walking Tobin to school, he boarded a bus downtown with his last resume, a few recommendation letters, and a small silver photograph tucked into the folder. He had promised Tobin he would come back with good news. He'd smiled while saying it, though he had only $9 left in his wallet. The lobby of Voss Global was larger than the public library in Callum's neighborhood. Sunlight poured through a 40-foot glass ceiling, reflecting off pale stone floors and steel sculptures shaped like human hearts. Receptionists wore matching gray uniforms. Visitors moved through security gates with digital badges. Callum stood among them in scuffed shoes, painfully aware of the frayed edges of his sleeves. He explained that he had no appointment, but needed 5 minutes with someone in engineering. The receptionist's polite expression hardened when she typed his name. A security alert flashed on her screen. Callum Rourke, former contractor, restricted access. 2 guards approached. Callum tried to stay calm, telling them there had been a misunderstanding years ago, that he only wanted to submit evidence proving his innocence. His voice carried farther than he meant it to. People began to stare. One of the guards took his elbow, and the folder fell open. Papers scattered across the floor. At that exact moment, Serafina stepped out of the private elevator with 3 executives and Maribel beside her. The child had come to the office because her school was closed for a teacher conference, and Serafina had promised they'd eat lunch together. Serafina noticed the commotion and immediately recognized Callum's surname. It belonged to the most dangerous scandal in her company's history, one her late father had ordered buried. She didn't recognize his face because 12 years earlier she had known him under a different name. Callum bent to gather the pages. Serafina stopped several feet away and asked why a restricted individual was still inside the building. Her voice was low, but it carried the authority of a slammed door. Callum looked up, and for a fraction of a second, both of them froze. Something moved behind Serafina's expression. A flicker of memory she quickly forced away. Callum stared at the woman he had once loved and realized she truly didn't know him. Years earlier, before Voss Global existed, Serafina had spent one summer volunteering at a rural health clinic under her middle name, Sarah Vale. She had wanted to escape her controlling father and find out whether she could build something meaningful without the Voss name attached to it. Callum had been a young engineer repairing medical equipment at the clinic. They fell in love among crowded hallways, broken generators, and long afternoons full of sunlight. Serafina never told him she was heir to a fortune. Callum never told her his own father was dying, or that he planned to leave the city to care for him. Their relationship ended in confusion after Serafina's father discovered them. He intercepted letters, threatened Callum's career, and convinced each of them that the other had simply walked away. Callum searched for Sarah Vale for months. He never found her. He didn't learn she was Serafina Voss until years later, when he saw her photograph in a business article. By then he was married, Tobin was a baby, and he believed the past belonged to another life. He had no idea Serafina had been pregnant when they were separated. In the lobby, though, Serafina saw only a man tied to betrayal. Her father had told her Callum stole research, manipulated her feelings, and tried to use their relationship to get access to the family company. She had believed him, because believing the lie hurt less than accepting that someone she loved had vanished without explanation. Callum tried to explain that he had evidence about the old prototype investigation. Serafina cut him off. She said Voss Global didn't reward men who showed up uninvited and expected sympathy to replace qualifications. Her eyes moved briefly over his worn clothes, his cheap folder. She told security to remove him and warned him never to come back. The humiliation landed harder because Maribel was watching. Callum gathered the last of the pages, stood slowly, and accepted that this door had closed for good. As he turned toward the exit, the photograph slipped from the folder and slid across the marble. It stopped near Maribel's shoe. The picture had been taken 12 years earlier, outside the rural clinic. Callum stood beside a younger Serafina beneath a flowering tree. She wore a simple yellow dress and laughed into the camera while Callum held her hand. On the back, in Serafina's handwriting, were the words, "For the man who made me believe I could have a life of my own." Maribel picked it up. The child stared at her mother's younger face, then at Callum. For years she had kept a hidden sketch in her bedroom drawer, a drawing based on a photograph she'd once found in her grandmother's attic. It showed the same man standing beside Serafina. When Maribel had asked who he was, her grandmother tore the photograph away and said he was no one. Now Maribel's small fingers tightened around Callum's picture. Something deep and certain moved through her. She crossed the lobby toward the executive dining room, where lunch had been laid out, but kept looking back at him. Serafina followed, unsettled. Callum was already being led toward the revolving doors when Maribel dropped her spoon, reached for her mother, and whispered, "Mom, that's my dad." Serafina felt the room tilt around her. She crouched beside Maribel and asked what she meant. Maribel showed her the photograph and explained she'd seen the same man before, hidden among old family belongings, that her grandmother once called him the mistake that almost ruined everything. Then Maribel asked why the man in the picture had the same small crescent-shaped scar beneath his left eye that she saw in the mirror beneath her own. Serafina looked toward the lobby. Callum was nearly outside. For the first time in her life, the CEO of Voss Global ran. Her heels struck the marble as employees stepped aside in shock. She reached the revolving doors just as Callum crossed onto the sunlit plaza. She called his name, not the formal name from the security report, but the name she'd used at the clinic. "Cal." He stopped. The city moved around them, buses passing, phones ringing, fountains glittering in the daylight. But Serafina could hear only her own breath. She held up the photograph and asked why he had kept it. Callum said it was the only proof that the happiest summer of his life had actually happened. Serafina told him she had written letters. Callum said he'd written dozens. Neither of them had received a single one. When Serafina asked whether he had known about Maribel, Callum's face changed. The question wounded him before he even understood it. He looked through the glass doors at the little girl standing inside, her hand pressed against the window. He noticed the shape of her eyes, the slight tilt of her head, the faint crescent scar beneath her eye. He whispered that he had never known. The truth kept unraveling in the hours that followed. Serafina canceled every meeting. She brought Callum into a private conference room, not as an applicant this time, but as the man whose life had been rewritten by her family's power. Legal archives were opened. Old email servers were searched. A retired assistant admitted that Serafina's father had ordered her to destroy personal letters. The original prototype investigation showed that Callum had discovered a safety defect that could have delayed a major product launch. Instead of fixing the problem, an executive had blamed him for accessing restricted files. That executive had since become Serafina's chief operating officer. By late afternoon, sunlight stretched across the conference room table in long golden bars. Serafina had spent years believing Callum abandoned her. Callum had spent years believing she chose wealth over him. Between them sat a daughter who had grown up asking why she was unwanted by a father who never even knew she existed. Maribel came in quietly and set the old photograph down between them. She didn't ask complicated questions. She simply moved close to Callum and studied his hands. Then she placed her small palm against his and smiled when their fingers lined up. Callum's composure finally broke. He lowered his head and cried, not loudly, but with the helpless grief of a man mourning every birthday, every fever, every first day of school, every moment stolen from him. Serafina watched him and understood that wealth had protected her from discomfort, but never from loss. Her father's control had shaped her whole life, and without realizing it, she had started treating people the way he had treated Callum. She judged quickly, trusted power, and treated vulnerability as weakness. That morning she had turned away a desperate man because of his clothes and an old accusation. By afternoon she knew he had once sacrificed his career to protect patients from a defective device, and a paternity test confirmed what Maribel had already known. Callum was her father. The discovery didn't create an instant, perfect family. Real life rarely changes that cleanly. Callum still had Tobin, a son afraid of being replaced. Serafina still carried years of distrust. Maribel wanted Callum close right away, while Callum struggled with guilt over loving a daughter he'd only just met. They started slowly. Callum visited the Voss home on weekend mornings. Maribel showed him her drawings. Tobin taught her how to fold paper airplanes. Serafina learned to sit at a kitchen table without checking her phone every 30 seconds. Some days were awkward. Some conversations ended in tears. But each honest moment repaired something the lies had broken. Serafina publicly cleared Callum's name and fired the executive who had framed him. She offered him a senior position, but he refused to accept it as charity. Instead, he presented a design for affordable, portable heart monitoring units meant for underfunded clinics, like the one where they'd met. The plan was brilliant. Voss Global funded the project, and Callum led it on his own merit. Months later, the first units were delivered to rural hospitals across the state. Callum stood on a sunlit stage beside Serafina, Tobin, and Maribel. Reporters expected a corporate speech. Instead, Serafina admitted that the company's greatest innovation had begun with a man she'd once silenced. She said leadership wasn't proven by never making mistakes, but by having the courage to face the harm those mistakes caused. Callum didn't become rich overnight, and Serafina didn't turn into a different person in a single day. But the poor single father she'd once dismissed became the one person willing to challenge her without fearing her power. In time, respect returned, then friendship, and eventually a deeper love, shaped not by youthful dreams, but by truth, patience, and forgiveness. One bright Saturday morning, nearly a year after their reunion, Serafina found Callum in the garden, helping Maribel and Tobin plant a young flowering tree. It was the same kind that had stood outside the clinic 12 years earlier. The children packed soil around the roots while Callum steadied the trunk. Serafina stepped into the sunlight. No assistance, no security, no board waiting on her decision. Maribel took one of her hands and placed it in Callum's. That simple gesture held everything they had lost and everything they'd been given back. If this story touched your heart, please like the video Share it with someone who needs it, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Echo Tales. Your support helps more stories about kindness, healing, and second chances reach people who may desperately need to hear them. Comment, "Truth heals," if you believe every child deserves to know they were always loved. The tree grew taller with every passing season, its roots strengthening beneath the ground even when no one could see them. That became the story of their family too. They weren't united because life had been fair. They were united because, after years of pain, they chose honesty instead of pride, forgiveness instead of blame, and love instead of fear. Serafina had once believed money could build walls strong enough to protect her from heartbreak. In the end, it was a poor single father, a forgotten photograph, and a little girl's whisper that finally showed her the truth. The most valuable things in life aren't the ones we own, but the people we're brave enough to recognize before it's too late.